Ed Miliband, this is the man who was part of a government that said no boom and bust in the economy and crashed our economy, jeopardising the future generations and life chances of millions of people in this country. I've apologised. I've taken responsibility for the mistakes I've made. Why don't you, in front of the British people, Ed Miliband, apologise for your role in crashing... No, don't say, nothing euphemistic. Say, I'm sorry for crashing the British economy.
The last ONS GDP statistics release before Election Day revised GDP growth higher for 2014 to 2.8% from the previous estimate of 2.6%, which is against 1.7% for 2013. The UK economy is now growing at its fastest pace since 2006 and leads the G7 countries, prompting George Osborne to tweet, "GDP revised upwards from 2.6% to 2.8% for 2014 confirms UK is clearly fastest growing major advanced economy," whilst Ed Balls responded, "This is the slowest recovery for 100 years and the Tories have failed to deliver the sustained rises in living standards they promised," though of course conveniently forgetting that the economy was recovering from the last Labour government's economic collapse. My long-standing forecast as of December 2009 is for the UK economy to grow by 1.4% for 2013 and 3.1% for 2014, totaling GDP of 4.5%, which is against the actual of 1.7% and 2.8%, also totaling 4.5%. The updated GDP graph illustrates that UK GDP during the past 5 years has closely matched my original forecast expectations of December 2009, with my forecast for the next 5 years due to be generated over the next few months. The economy remains the primary voter issue because without an economy, no government can do anything. The GDP graph clearly illustrates that as forecast, the coalition's economic recovery was one of two halves. The first 3 years of austerity to try and get a grip on the nation's finances following Labour's economic collapse that resulted in an 170 billion annual deficit, followed by 2 years to achieve a debt-fueled election mini-economic boom that was tweaked to peak during May 2015. This table better illustrates the comparison of economic growth between Labour and coalition, as the economic collapse of 2008 to 2009 virtually wiped out the growth of the preceding years of the Labour government that only marginally recovered into Q1 2010 on the back of 170 billion of unsustainable deficit spending that left Labour with GDP growth over 5 years of just 3.4% and the cumulative quarterly GDP of only 3.3%, which illustrates the magnitude of the economic collapse. Whilst the Conservatives' current 2-year economic bounce has overcome the stagnation of their first 3 years to leave GDP 9.5% higher, however, a cumulative quarterly GDP comes in at a lower 8.8% that reflects just how close the UK came to going back into recession during 2012. Therefore, where the economy is concerned, there is really no comparison between the last Labour government and the Conservative coalition in terms of GDP growth, as the coalition has achieved near 3 times the growth of the last Labour government, this despite attempting to reduce Labour's out-of-control budget deficit.
Did you borrow too much?
I think that the global financial crisis, is what drove borrowing up.
Did you borrow too much?
The figure was too high by the end of our time in government as a result of the global financial crisis.
Working, but it is worth remembering as we debate cuts, why did these cuts have to happen? What is the truth about cuts? Well, I've got the truth about cuts here. This is a copy of the letter that Labour left in the Treasury when we arrived in government 5 years ago, and it says, "I'm sorry, we've run out of money." That is the truth of what happened. So when people talk about cuts, we had to make these decisions because the British economy was on the brink. People were worrying about whether we'd be able to pay our debts. And the brunt of these cuts and the changes we've made, the top 20% have paid more than the remaining 80% put together. But that's what happened when Labour were in power. And my fear is if they got in power, they'd do it all over again.
Firstly, the deficit does not equate to being the nation's overdraft, as the deficit is in fact new debt that is added to Britain's growing debt mountain at the rate of 100 billion per year. The last Labour government accrued debt in its last 5-year term of 532 billion, whilst the current coalition government will have accrued debt of at least 536 billion over its full 5-year term. Therefore, David Cameron is wrong to state that the coalition has borrowed less than the last Labour government, in nominal terms at least. David Cameron also stated that the stock of debt as a proportion of the economy has fallen. However, as this graph illustrates, debt to GDP in May 2010 was 55% and has since risen every year to a peak of 75% of GDP for this financial year. The bottom green line explains why the increase in debt has not so far had any negative economic consequences, because the Bank of England has been busy monetizing UK government debt to the extent that it now holds approximately 1/3 of government debt, which means that the effective debt burden is around 38% rather than 75% of GDP, as most of the interest earned on this debt is repaid back to the government, i.e. creative accounting. However, there is a price to pay for printing money in the form of QE and government bonds, and that is to cause inflation, as the exponential inflation trend illustrates, which makes me laugh when I see academics and journalists panicking over the threat of deflation, when the consistent overriding trend is one of exponential inflation, just as I warned of in my January 2010 Inflation Megatrend ebook that you can download for free at the Market Oracle website.
Did you spend too much?
Well, I think there were spending programs that maybe weren't as good as they could have been, but I don't believe, that I don't believe, no,
it's a clue, come on.
No, it's an important point.
Which ones weren't quite as good as they should have been?
Look, it's an important point. No government gets it completely right.
It's a very important point. That's why it's important to have some details.
Yeah, okay, let me just say, I think the overall point was the financial crisis caused by overspending by Labour. No, the answer is no. I think investment in health and education...
You're asking yourself a question I haven't asked you. My question was, did you borrow too much? You think, no, you didn't borrow too much. Did you spend too much? Some programmes, perhaps.
Now you're asking yourself questions.
Isn't it? Oh, well, I'm trying to summarise your position according to the questions you've been asked rather than the questions you've asked yourself.
Look, what I would say is, for example, the Dome was not a good example of the way money is spent. Governments make mistakes. Governments make mistakes. There are always inefficiencies in government. Of course there are inefficiencies. Probably too many reorganisations of public services which waste money. Of course that's right.
Ed Miliband admits that the last Labour government badly overspent, but blames the financial crisis for the borrowing, and repeatedly tries to avoid answering the question by making up his own. However, the reality is that spending under the last Labour government was literally out of control, running a huge budget deficit of 100 billion in its last year that literally threatened bankruptcy as the climax of a decade-long accelerating debt-fueled spending binge, as Labour rewarded its vested interest in the public sector with huge expansion in budgets, including the tripling in the budgets in many cases, such as for the NHS. What happened to GP pay is one of the best examples of financial irresponsibility under Labour, as GP pay literally soared into the stratosphere, increasing by as much as 35% per annum, far beyond the rates of average earnings increases that acted as an incentive for GPs to work less hours, abandoning out-of-hours care that prompted a huge crisis in the NHS. So doubling in GP pay resulted in far worse GP services, which in part contributed to the MP expenses scandal, as when Labour came to power, average MP pay was virtually the same as average NHS GP pay of 44k. So both were in line with one another at that time. However, as this graph clearly illustrates, that the 2003 GPs contracts allowed GPs to award themselves huge pay hikes of over 30% per annum at taxpayers' expense. That has lifted average GP pay to $126,000 per annum against $64,000 for MPs. To imagine that a Labour government would cut public spending is delusional, because it is just not in Labour's DNA to cut public spending, as the last Labour government illustrates, when the budget deficit literally soared out of control and debt and liabilities were multiplying, increasing from 1.4 trillion in 2005 to 4 trillion in 2010. Labour had literally brought Britain to the brink of financial collapse.
But what I'm hearing in this debate is that whereas I want to save £1 out of every £100 the government spends to not put up taxes, what I'm hearing is more debt and more taxes, more debt and more taxes, a lot more debt and more taxes, some more debt and more taxes, and definitely more debt and more taxes.
The Conservatives claim much success at having created 1.9 million jobs over the past 5 years, and pledge to increase another 2 million jobs over the next 5 years. However, about half of these jobs created have gone to migrant workers. Nevertheless, employment has been a huge success for the coalition, that translates into UK unemployment falling by 1 million from its 2012 peak of 2.7 million and 600,000 over its 5-year term, which is much better than forecast expectations, and which is set against Labour's disastrous track record that saw unemployment soar by nearly 1 million during Labour's last year in government. However, the headline rate masks the truth of real unemployment that currently stands at over 9 million, as coalition government has failed to reverse the Labour catastrophe of creating near 10 million vested interest of economically inactive working age population, which also warns of what would happen under Labour, a resumption of the trend for increasing the number of vested interests on benefits that are not included in the official unemployment statistics.
Can you help us with another of your policies, the mansion tax? According to your leader in Scotland, this is a way of taking money out of the southeast of England and giving it to Scotland.
No.
That is what he said.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't what he said.
Well, he said specifically there weren't enough properties in Scotland to raise the mansion tax that would fund the Scottish NHS. It was a way of taking money from the southeast of England and spending it in Scotland.
Shall I explain?
Do, please.
So we're going to levy a mansion tax on homes above £2 million. Now, it is true that most of those homes are in the southeast, and it's also true that there are consequentials of that spending for Scotland. That's the way the United Kingdom works.
Consequentials?
Well, it's the way the money gets distributed, and that some of that money will be spent in Scotland. But let me make this point, because it's really important. This is part of being a United Kingdom. If there are young people who are unemployed in Newcastle, and the money for a banker's bonus tax, more of it is raised in London, we help those young people in Newcastle. If another tax falls somewhere else, then we help people across the United Kingdom. If there are poor kids in London, we help them. So that is part of being a United Kingdom. You have redistribution across the United Kingdom. So this is absolutely a principle of a country that stays together and looks after each other.
What about Alex Salmond's other types of blood money that he would like to exempt or exert from England? What about, for example, a promise not to recommission Trident, perhaps move it out of Scotland? Would you go along with that?
No.
No, you wouldn't. What about starting the high-speed rail line back to front, as it were, in Scotland?
No, look, I'm not going to get into a bargaining game with Alex Salmond. Look, he's not...
You are?
No, I'm not.
You are. If you have any chance of forming a government, you will, won't you?
No, don't be so presumptuous. You've got 6 weeks to go. You've got 6 weeks to go.
Meanwhile, the Labour Party is fighting a losing battle against the SNP insurgency in Scotland that seeks to take virtually all of the Labour MPs, which means that Labour could only form a government whilst in some sort of coalition with the SNP, and as Alex Salmond keeps repeatedly making clear, that they would hold the balance of power and Labour would dance to their tune.
If you hold the balance, then you hold the power. Any minority government has to negotiate in order to win a majority for its proposal. That's patently obvious, and to deny that is deny reality. When I faced that reality in the Scottish Parliament, I couldn't say, well, I wish it was different. You had to get down and do your best for the people under these circumstances. And if the SNP are in these circumstances, it'll be very good for Scotland, certainly.
Alex Salmond's statements have prompted the Conservatives to cry wolf once more on the prospects of a Labour SNP government.
You may have thought that after his defeat in the Scottish referendum, Alex Salmond would have packed it in. Oh no, he has set his sights on a bigger prize. By standing for the constituency of Gordon, he intends to take a seat at Westminster. And with the SNP seats won from Labour in his grasp, put Mr. Miliband into power, and then call the tune.
Unfortunately, this time the Conservatives are right to warn of what would happen during a SNP-Labour government, which, as my February election forecast 2015 analysis concluded, would be a catastrophe for the UK. The UK dodged a bullet last September as the tunnel vision SNP failed in their efforts for the UK to disintegrate that would have resulted in a catastrophic breakup of the UK, as I covered at the time. However, the SNP are not done with the UK, for their new cunning plan is to literally bankrupt Britain as part of a minority Labour government, to financially bleed the UK dry, leaving it a hollow husk before declaring independence, as illustrated by SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon's recent statements, to force the UK to print an extra 180 billion of debt to finance spending on vested interests. However, against this we compare the austerity coalition's debt record that by May 2015 will have borrowed an extra 130 billion more than they said they would in 2010, and in total added 500 billion to Britain's national debt. Now imagine what would happen under an anti-austerity SNP Labour government, who would print at least 1 trillion of new debt that would increase the total to 2.5 trillion, that would result in rampant inflation, i.e. probably exceed 10% per annum. Just as spectacular as being the collapse in the oil price as is the collapse in the SNP's economic master plan for an independent Scotland that was wholly based on reaping huge rewards from North Sea oil exports, where SNP propaganda had convinced many Scots to effectively vote to commit economic suicide. That came close to achieving the catastrophe on the basis of a propaganda implying raising of North Sea oil tax revenues from 7 billion to 11 billion per year. But today, barely a few months later, has evaporated to virtually nothing. So be under no illusion that an inept Miliband government will be wagged by the SNP tail, will be able to do anything other than to plunge from worsening crisis to the next. Probably even worse than Gordon Brown's financial collapse, all the way to the disintegration of the United Kingdom. Virtually all of the pollsters point to a Labour bloodbath in Scotland, as they could lose as many as 40 seats to the SNP, with suggested tallies of as high as 57 SNP MPs, as illustrated by May2015.com. The recent debates have introduced much volatility in the opinion polls, with Labour and Conservatives taking turns to flip-flop into the lead, though still remaining virtually neck and neck. May2015.com tends to yo-yo all over the place, where one day it's Labour in the lead and the next is the Conservatives. Though the overriding trend implies a very gradual convergence towards my forecast, which it may just achieve just prior to election day. Electoralcalculus.co.uk have been exhibiting a consistent strong bias towards Labour, which has slowly been eroding over time. That again implies a gradual trend towards convergence from my forecast by election day, but has a lot further to go than May2015.com. Electionforecast.co.uk, after consistently putting the Conservatives in a clear seats lead, now post debates have both parties virtually neck and neck, so appear to be trending in the opposite direction, i.e. favouring Labour. Whilst the Guardian continues to maintain a marginal advantage to the Conservatives over Labour, currently within a tight 4-seat swing. Overall, the opinion pollsters are trending in favour of the Conservative Party, which, if the trend continues, implies that the Conservatives will be the largest party, which is in line with my forecast expectations for the Tories to lead with at least 296 seats. Another point of difference is that the pollsters continue to grossly overestimate the number of seats the SNP will win, i.e. typically 50 to 55, which is set against my forecast of just 35. So, in my judgment, the opinion polls, whilst trending in the right direction, are currently still wrong, as they continue to persistently underestimate the number of seats the Conservatives will actually win, who could even win an outright majority on May 7th. In terms of what I actually see as the most probable outcome for the general election, then I refer to my in-depth analysis of 28th of February. The remaining balance of 558 seats, split according to the consensus view such as May2015.com, would result in Labour leading on 281 seats against Conservatives on about 277. However, this analysis suggests that the opinion polls are grossly underestimating the number of seats the Conservatives will actually win on May 7th, where there is even a chance for the Conservatives to win an outright majority, though probability favours another hung parliament. However, given the UKIP surge, it will be tough for the Conservatives to retain their current tally of 302 MPs, as I expect at least 3 will be lost to UKIP and many more lost to Labour, against which at least a handful will likely be gained from the Lib Dems, which therefore suggests that the Tories will achieve a seat total in the 290s. My forecast conclusion is for the Conservatives to win 296 seats at the May 7th general election and Labour second on 262 seats, and the full seats per political party breakdown as shown. Therefore, the most probable outcome is for a continuation of the condemned coalition government on 326 seats, i.e. Conservative 296 plus Lib Dem 30, where any shortfall would likely find support from the DUP's 8 seats. The alternative is for a truly messy Labour, Liberal, SNP supported chaotic government on about 327 seats, which in my opinion would be a truly disastrous outcome for Britain, nearly as bad as if Scotland had voted for independence last September. Another possibility is that should the Conservatives do better than forecast, i.e. secure over 300 seats, but still fail to win an overall majority, then they may choose to go it alone with the plan to work towards winning a May 2016 general election. The bottom line is that the opinion polls do not reflect how people will actually vote on May 7th, when they are faced with the stark choice of a steady as she goes condemned government or take a huge gamble on Ed Miliband's Labour Party. So in my opinion, several millions of voters will choose to play it safe with the condemned government which thus is the most probable outcome.